Did you know that world history once turned in a completely different direction because of a single letter? Not a treaty, not a declaration of war, not a thunderous battle that shook the earth, just a handwritten letter, a few thin pages of paper. And yet, it pushed millions of people into war, altered the fate of an entire continent, and reshaped the global order for generations to come. If that letter had never existed, or if it had arrived a little later, or in the wrong hands, the world we live in today might look utterly different. So what was this letter? Who wrote it? And why did it carry such extraordinary weight? To understand how a single letter could shake the entire world order, we have to return to Europe in the early 20th century, a place that appeared stable on the surface, but beneath it lay a massive powder keg. The great empires of the time were not only competing for territory, but also for honor, military strength, and global influence. Britain dominated the oceans with its powerful navy. France carried a deep and bitter resentment toward Germany after its defeat in 1871. Russia longed to expand its influence across Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and Germany, a young empire, was impatient to prove itself as the foremost power on the European continent. Military alliances were signed one after another, not to preserve peace, but to prepare for war. In such a climate, even the smallest incident could trigger an uncontrollable chain reaction. In 1914, the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir in Sarajevo was not the true root cause of the war. It was merely the perfect pretext. Within a matter of weeks, all of Europe was drawn into conflict. What few had expected was that the war would not end quickly, as so many leaders had confidently predicted. Instead, it sank into a brutal stalemate. Trenches, machine guns, and heavy artillery turned the front lines into enormous killing fields. Millions of soldiers were killed or wounded, and the economies of the warring nations began to collapse, especially Germany, which faced a severe naval blockade that slowly strangled its supply lines. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States maintained a position of neutrality. Most Americans believed that Europe was destroying itself in a meaningless war, and that there was no reason for the United States to shed blood over old rivalries an ocean away. Yet this neutrality was not entirely impartial. American banks and corporations provided massive loans, food supplies, weapons, and raw materials to Britain and France. In reality, the American economy was becoming increasingly tied to an Allied victory. German leaders understood this clearly. Even without entering the war, the United States had already become a decisive factor in its outcome. By 1916 and 1917, Germany's situation had grown extremely dangerous. Supplies were running low, public morale was collapsing, and the hope for a swift victory had all but disappeared. German military leaders turned to a desperate gamble. If they could not stop the United States from supporting Britain and France, then they would have to force America into crisis on its own soil. Berlin's attention shifted south, toward Mexico, America's neighbor, a nation struggling with instability after years of revolution and civil war. Relations between Mexico and Washington were already strained by past territorial losses and repeated military interventions. Out of desperation, strategic calculation, and the belief that events could be manipulated from afar, a bold plan was born. A secret letter was written, not as an ordinary diplomatic proposal, but as a final move meant to alter the fate of the entire war. And in that moment, history quietly changed direction, set in motion by just a few pages of paper sent out into the world in silence. The letter was written in January 1917 by Germany's Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann. History would later remember it as the Zimmermann telegram. What made it extraordinary was not only its content, but its timing and the strategic mindset behind every carefully chosen word. At the time, Germany was preparing to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, a decision almost guaranteed to provoke the United States. Berlin understood that America might declare war, but German leaders believed that if they moved fast enough and boldly enough, they could still control the consequences. In the letter, Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico in the event that the United States entered the war against Germany. In return, Berlin promised financial, military, and diplomatic support to help Mexico reclaim territories it had lost to the United States after the War of 1848, including Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. What is often overlooked is that Germany never truly believed Mexico could defeat the United States. The real objective was to force Washington to divide its attention and resources to focus on defending its southern border, and in doing so, delay or weaken American intervention in Europe. The letter went even further, suggesting that Mexico attempt to draw Japan into the alliance, creating pressure from both the Pacific and the Atlantic at the same time. From a technical standpoint, Germany believed the plan was completely secure. The entire message was encoded using advanced diplomatic ciphers and transmitted through international telegraph cables. Ironically, because Germany had been allowed to use British-controlled cables for so-called civilian diplomatic messages, the letter passed directly through a system monitored by British intelligence. In London, a top-secret code-breaking unit intercepted the transmission. At first, only fragments could be read, but piece by piece, the full message emerged, and with it, a stunning realization. This was not merely a diplomatic maneuver, but an indirect declaration of war against the United States. The British now faced a dangerous dilemma. If they revealed the letter immediately, they would expose the fact that they were intercepting international cable communications, jeopardizing an invaluable intelligence operation and potentially damaging relations with the United States. So they waited. Carefully, deliberately, they constructed a perfect cover story. Through agents in Mexico, the British arranged for the letter to appear as if it had been stolen there, then conveniently passed into their hands. When the evidence was finally presented to Washington, it appeared credible, without revealing the intelligence secret behind it. When President Woodrow Wilson first read the letter, his initial reaction was disbelief. But once its authenticity was confirmed, all doubt vanished. For the first time, Americans could see clearly that the war in Europe was no longer distant or abstract. A foreign power was actively plotting to incite conflict on American soil, and was even prepared to carve up the nation's territory to achieve its strategic goals. When the contents of the letter were released to the public, outrage swept across the United States. Newspapers called it a blatant betrayal, undeniable proof that Germany posed a direct threat. Within weeks, public opinion shifted from skepticism to fury. And just months later, the United States formally entered the First World War. A letter written in secrecy, intended to delay war, became the single most powerful catalyst drawing America into the conflict, and in doing so, accelerated Germany's path toward defeat. What is most astonishing is not the content of the letter itself, but the power of information. No weapons, no armies, just a few lines of text, yet enough to shift a nation's decision from neutrality to war. The entry of the United States completely transformed the course of the First World War, accelerating the collapse of Germany and its allies. From that moment on, a new world order began to take shape, setting off political, economic, and social consequences that would echo for decades. The letter also reveals a sobering truth. History is not shaped only on battlefields. It is written in quiet rooms through words that seem harmless at first glance. A single miscalculation, one flawed assumption, can unleash consequences far beyond human imagination. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: if that letter had never been deciphered, if it had not been revealed at precisely the right moment, the United States might have remained outside the war for much longer. History, at times, is not changed by grand events, but by a small, silent letter, one powerful enough to turn the course of the world.